Break your femur today, and a chain of systems catches you before you hit the ground. Someone calls an ambulance. Strangers with training arrive. There is a hospital, an X-ray machine, a surgeon, a titanium rod, a bed, a pharmacy, and 6 weeks of someone else preparing your food while your body knits itself back together. Now take all of that away. No hospital, no painkiller, no crutch, no stored food, no building, no one whose job it is to help you. You are one of maybe 25 people who move constantly across open country, who eat what they find that day, and who cannot afford to stop. Your leg is broken. You cannot walk. You cannot hunt, gather, carry, run from a predator, or contribute a single calorie to the group. Under those conditions, a broken femur takes somewhere between 6 weeks and 6 months to heal. That is 6 months of someone else feeding you, 6 months of someone carrying you when the group moves, 6 months of you being in the coldest possible accounting, a cost. The intuitive answer is that you die, that the group leaves you. That prehistory was a brutal arithmetic in which the weak were abandoned because there was no other option. The bones say otherwise, over and over and over again, across continents, across hundreds of thousands of years, and across at least 4 different human species. The bones say otherwise. There is a story that circulates about the anthropologist Margaret Mead being asked what she considered the first sign of civilization in a culture. She supposedly answered, a healed femur. Because, in the animal world, a broken leg is a death sentence. You cannot flee, you cannot drink, you are eaten. A healed femur means someone stayed. There is no record that Mead ever actually said this, and it should be treated as a story rather than a quotation. But here is the strange part. The claim underneath the story is testable, and when you test it, it holds. Start at the oldest edge of the evidence, in the Republic of Georgia, at a site called Dmanisi. Roughly 1.77 million years ago, a small population of early Homo was living there. Not modern humans, not anything close, but our ancestors, with brains about half the size of ours. Among the skulls recovered from that site is one, catalog D3444, that stops researchers cold. The individual had lost almost every tooth in their head, not at death, years before it. We know it was years because the tooth sockets had completely resorbed. When a tooth comes out, the bone that held it slowly dissolves and smooths over. That process takes a long time. This person's jaw was smooth. They had been living in the East African-derived world of nearly 2 million years ago without the ability to chew. There is honest debate about what this proves. Some researchers argue the individual could have survived on soft plant foods or bone marrow without help. But even the most conservative reading requires that someone was processing food into a form this person could swallow, or that the group was tolerating a member who could not participate in the hardest physical work of staying alive. There was no fire in reliable use yet, no cooking pots, no agriculture for another 1.7 million years. Someone made it possible for that person to eat. Move forward to about 45,000 years ago, into a cave in the Zagros Mountains of northern Iraq called Shanidar. Inside it, archaeologists found the remains of a Neanderthal man designated Shanidar I and nicknamed Nandi. He is possibly the single most important skeleton in this entire story. His injuries read like a catalog, a crushing blow to the left side of his face, severe enough that he was almost certainly blind in his left eye. His right arm was withered and useless, either amputated above the elbow or paralyzed from a childhood injury, with the bone atrophied from decades of disuse. Bony growths in both ear canals, a condition that would have left him substantially or completely deaf. Degenerative damage to his right leg and foot that made walking painful and unstable, and every single one of those injuries shows extensive healing. He did not die of them. He lived with them in a landscape full of large predators for years, possibly decades, reaching an age of around 40, which for a Neanderthal was old. A deaf, half-blind, one-armed man with a limp does not hunt. He does not outrun anything. He does not carry a carcass. In a world of pure calculation, he does not exist past the week of his injuries. It is worth pausing here, because good documentaries admit the argument. Some anthropologists, most notably Catherine Detweiler, have pushed back hard on the compassion reading, pointing out that survival with disability is documented in societies that treat disabled people appallingly, and that we cannot excavate feelings. That criticism is fair, and it should change how we phrase the conclusion. We cannot prove that Nandi was loved, but we can prove that he was fed. And that is not a small thing to be able to prove about a man who died 450 centuries ago. Now consider a second Neanderthal, from La Chapelle-aux-Saints in France, roughly 50,000 years ago. The man history knows as the Old Man. He had lost most of his teeth, again with the sockets resorbed, meaning years of toothlessness. He had severe degenerative joint disease in his spine, his hip, and his shoulder. He was, by any physical measure, a wreck. This skeleton has a second story attached to it. When the anatomist Marcellin Boule reconstructed it in 1911, he read the arthritis-deformed spine as normal anatomy, and produced the image that defined Neanderthals for the next 50 years. Stooped, shuffling, knuckle-dragging, stupid. Nearly every cartoon caveman you have ever seen descends from that reconstruction, which means the single specimen that did the most damage to Neanderthal reputation was, in fact, one of the strongest pieces of evidence that Neanderthals kept their sick alive. Then there is Borneo, and a young adult buried around 31,000 years ago in a cave called Liang Tebo. Their lower left leg is missing, and the bone ends are not shattered, not gnawed, not crushed. They are clean and they are healed, with the smooth remodeled surfaces that only form when a person survives. This is currently the oldest known evidence of a successful surgical amputation, and it happened roughly 24,000 years before agriculture. To pull it off in a tropical rainforest, someone had to understand where the major vessels ran, control the bleeding, cut through bone without causing fatal shock, and then manage the wound through the most dangerous window of all, the weeks afterward, in a hot, humid, bacteria-rich environment where infection kills. The individual then lived another 6 to 9 years with one leg, in mountainous terrain, before dying of something else entirely and being buried with care. That is not luck. That is a medical tradition, with accumulated knowledge behind it, practiced by people we still casually call primitive. The medicine goes further. At El Cidrón in northern Spain, researchers analyzed hardened dental plaque from Neanderthals who lived around 48,000 years ago. In the calculus of one young man, a man whose jaw shows a dental abscess and whose gut DNA suggests he was suffering from a stomach parasite, they found traces of poplar, a tree that contains salicylic acid. That is the active compound in aspirin. They also found evidence of Penicillium mold, the genus that gives us penicillin. The cautious reading is that this could be incidental. The less cautious reading is that a sick Neanderthal was chewing painkiller and mold while his healthy neighbors were not. Either way, this is a species that was paying attention to what plants did to bodies. Care also extended to people who were never going to be able to keep up at all. At Romito Cave in southern Italy, around 11,000 years ago, a teenager was buried who had a form of severe dwarfism affecting the growth of the arms and legs. This was a mobile hunting population living in mountainous country. That adolescent could not have kept pace, could not have hunted, could not have foraged competitively, and reached the age of about 17 anyway, then received a careful burial alongside an adult woman. And then there is the case that changed how archaeologists talk about all of this. At Man Bac in northern Vietnam, about 4,000 years ago, a young man was buried in the fetal position. Analysis of his skeleton showed a fused, deformed spine consistent with a congenital condition and paralysis from roughly the waist down, probably from around the age of puberty. His arm bones show severe wasting. He lived like that for approximately a decade. Consider what a decade of that requires from other people. In a village with no plumbing, no soap, no antibiotics, and no wheelchairs, he had to be fed. He had to be given water. He had to be cleaned repeatedly, every day. He had to be physically turned and repositioned because a paralyzed body left in one position develops pressure sores, and pressure sores in that world lead to sepsis and death within months. He had to be moved, sheltered, protected, and kept warm through 10 years of seasons. The researchers who studied him, Lorna Tilley and Mark Oxenham, used the case to build an entire methodology, the bioarchaeology of care, a formal system for reading from a skeleton exactly how much labor other human beings must have invested to produce that skeleton's survival. Because that is what care actually is, stripped of sentiment. It is labor. It is logistics. It is calories redirected away from the productive and toward the unproductive, on purpose for years, by people who had very little margin. And this is the thing that ties every one of these cases together. None of them are acts of feeling. All of them are acts of engineering. Caring for a broken femur means someone worked out immobilization. Caring for a toothless elder means someone worked out food processing. Caring for an amputee means someone worked out surgery, hemostasis, and wound management. Caring for a paralyzed man for 10 years means someone worked out sanitation and pressure sore prevention without ever having heard either phrase. These are technologies. They were invented, tested against death, refined, and taught, and they were invented far earlier than almost anyone assumes. Here is what that means for how you understand human history. The phrase survival of the fittest gets read almost universally as survival of the strongest individual. The archaeological record of care suggests something close to the opposite. What made our lineage successful was not that we discarded our weak, it was that we developed the capacity to carry them. And that capacity had a return. The toothless elder who cannot chew is also the person who has seen 4 droughts and knows which valley still holds water in the 5th. The half-blind man who cannot hunt is also the man who has been making tools for 30 years and can teach a 14-year-old to do it in one season. The child who survives a shattered leg because someone splinted it becomes an adult who reproduces. A species that keeps its injured alive keeps its knowledge alive, and a species that keeps its knowledge alive accumulates it. Everything that follows, agriculture, writing, cities, medicine, the phone you are watching this on, sits on top of that one behavior. Care was not a luxury that emerged once humans got comfortable. It was the infrastructure that made getting comfortable possible. So when you picture the deep past, correct the image. It was not a world where the injured were left behind. It was a world where a group of people with no metal, no writing, and no medicine looked at a member who could no longer contribute and decided, for reasons they never wrote down and we can only infer from the smooth edges of their bones, to feed them anyway. You exist because that decision was made repeatedly for hundreds of thousands of years by people whose names are gone. Every single person alive today is descended from someone who was carried. That is not sentiment. That is what the bones say.